Ron Dembo. Our next speaker for today, Ron is the founder of Riskthinking.ai. Ron has had a distinguished academic research career at Yale University and was the founder and CEO of Algorithmics Incorporated, growing it organically from a startup to the world's largest enterprise risk management software company. And Ron's going to speak with us today about how to calculate climate financial risk. Ron, are you with us? Hello.
Yes, thank you. Thanks very much, Paul. So this talk is really probably somewhat more on the technical side, and it really deals with the E in ESG, which is a lot more than, you know, carbon. There's a ton of other things, and there's a tremendous amount of data issues around this. So I want to talk about that. And, you know, in particular, the issues around policies, which will affect how much carbon is emitted, the economy and how it's run, the physical risks that are not or dealt with, and the social risks. I'll talk a lot about social, but in one of the previous talks, we had questions about social. I think one of the biggest things that is missing is how the E implies S. So in other words, environmental risks that actually cause social upheavals. It's not hard to find examples of those. So let me just mention one or two things. The problem of looking at climate financial risk is really one of radical uncertainty. Everything is uncertain. The economics of it, the climate science, no matter which way you look, there's radical uncertainty. And the problem that I see, the biggest problem I see, is that people are tackling this today with deterministic reasoning. In other words, you know, you pick one scenario and you come up with some strategy based on that. Or at best, you pick another one and another one. But a true handling of this from a risk point of view has been missing. So let me actually show how we go about this.
Sure.
If you were to, are you seeing my slides?
Yes, we are. Yes.
Okay, good.
It's a map of the world.
That's good. So one of the biggest things about climate is that it depends on you know, climate science and the climate drivers. For example, if you had an El Nino year, it would affect the east coast of the US and the west coast differently, and Europe differently, but simultaneously. So really that has to be taken into account. The geography is really extremely important. So is an asset. You know, a bond is a bond is a bond when you're looking at financial risk, but a cement plant in Europe and a identical cement plant in, you know, California would have very different risks. So all of that has to be taken into account. That's another layer that's well beyond normal financial risk. So we look at that world in the following way. We divide the entire world, including oceans, into small hexagons. And in our case, there's about 33 billion of them. And each hexagon goes down to something like an average of 60 square meters. But in some cases, like the Netherlands, they could be as small as half a square meter. So in other words, we could tell you what's happening to the shed in your backyard.
Okay.
Now, you might need to know, why would you need to know such detail? Well, if you've got a house that's next to a river and another one just adjacent that's sitting on a little bump that's above river flooding level, clearly you need to know that, how to differentiate that. So this is a massive problem. You know, the scale of this problem is absolutely enormous if you're going to look at it in this stochastic way. So for example, in every one of those hexagons, you need all of history from 1850 to now for both climate and the economy. Each hexagon has a different economy, for example, and a different set of climate risks. You need to understand the future, which is really the issue, from now to 2100. And the only way to get that is really by looking into the heads of people who will affect that future, by looking into models, thinking of them as some, mad scientists predicting a version of the future. And finally, by really implementing methods that deal with the radical uncertainty. So, for example, in every little pixel, there are normally on average 25 risk factors that we look at. And we look at the distribution of every one of them in every future point in time. Why do you do that? Because, it's no good to talk about the sea level rise in Singapore in 2050 as a number. It's really the distribution of possible values, some more likely than others. So when you look at this, there's something like a trillion data points that you have to deal with. So how do you even manage something like this? Well, there's a thing called AI and natural language processing. And, the old adage of don't boil the ocean falls apart in this world. You need to boil the ocean to actually structure all of this unstructured data. And that's what's called a knowledge graph. And you need natural language processing to actually generate the data on that graph and mine it. So let's take an example. If I was to look at, say, flood risk, which is just a single factor, and let's say I was just looking at it at a single point in Germany, or I could take the Ottawa Valley. What I would see is in 2030, there's some distribution of possible flood risk. In 2050, there might be a different distribution. And in 2070, even more different. So I need to have all of these distributions. And we get them by actually doing that AI and by reading about 250,000 scientific papers daily to actually understand how science might change the perception of that future. So if I were to look at a single guess on that distribution, that black dot in 2030, and another single guess in 2050 and another one in 2070, I have a description of the transition of that flood risk factor over time. Now, this is where we differ completely from what you see in current methods. In current methods, the input to the data is transitions. So let me give you an example. The NGFS, which is a collection of about 100 plus central banks, has come out with transition scenarios, and they're used repeatedly. So is the IEA, so has IPCC. It is physically impossible for an individual or any human to look at 1,700 factors, which is the number that's in an NGFS scenario, and understand how to get combinations of those factors that make any sense. It's just impossible. The combinatorics of it is outrageous. It's more than the total number of grains of sand in the universe. So what we do is quite different. We look at this as in a fundamental risk way, where we uncover the uncertainty in each location in the world for each factor. And what we get is an implied transition. The other big issue is that when TCFD came out with its announcement, they separated transition risk and physical risk. Well, that's a completely crazy artifact, because transitions are going to affect physical. It's clear that in a world of 1.5 degrees, you're going to get very different physical risks in a world of 3 degrees. So they're intimately linked, and this does that. How do we link them? We have algorithms that can take those uncertainty distributions and generate multi-factor scenarios, which can be used to stress test physical assets. Once again, humans find it impossible to generate scenarios on multiple factors simultaneously. So you need algorithms, because you don't want 6 people sitting in Germany dreaming up scenarios. and another in California dreaming up scenarios, and expect to get consistent numbers. So consistency plays a big role. So there's a lot of mathematics here, there's a lot of data, but it's all feasible. And at the end of the day, what you get by stress testing is a distribution. So this speaks to another point. In a radically uncertain world, there's no such thing as a solution. There's a set of possible solutions. And even in a 99.9% certain situation, the 1% can occur. That's what radical risk is all about. So we generate distributions as outputs, and that allows us to do something that's quite amazing and in great demand today, which is, how do I as a corporation look at a bespoke scenario, something that really affects me only because I've got an unusual set of assets in an unusual set of geographies, not some generic transition scenario. I want to know what will affect me. In our case, that is just simply a target value on this distribution. It separates the upside from the downside. So in the upside, each of those bars is all the scenarios that yield a particular upside. And each bar that's orange is a set of scenarios that yield a particular downside. And the blue is a benchmark. A desired value in this case might be a 1.5 degree world or a net zero world for me. But it's, once again, net zero for me with my specific physical assets, my specific locations, and so on. And by having this analysis with all of this detail, you can now do fantastic things like just give me what your target is, and I'll tell you immediately what your rating is. We have a set of ratings which are also respect this radical uncertainty. For example, a U3 would be the upside is 3 times the downside. It's pretty easy to understand, pretty easy to communicate. A D4 would mean the downside is 4 times more likely than the upside. And that's a much more sensible kind of rating than a triple B plus or something like that, which is a deterministic statement about a very uncertain future. So just to give you a sense, this is a product that's about to come out in about a month's time. And it will address 40% of all the world's invested assets through a partner of ours, the Bank of New York Mellon. And it shows you that even with such a complex set of data and such a complex set of analysis, once you've done all that hard work, how easy it can be to compare your portfolio's risk to some benchmark. And we do this both for physical assets and for investment assets. It's also easy to actually, because we're doing stuff bottom up, it's easy to go right down and say, well, where does this come from? How does my portfolio compare to a benchmark on, say, policy risk? Policy risk is totally missing in ESG, really. I've never seen it. For example, Biden says no more gas cars after 2030 or 2035. Well, guess what? That policy statement affects the GDP of Mexico because every car plant in Mexico will have to re-engineer itself by 2035. And you can go and look at this in other ways, like by sector and so on. So that's a lot to absorb, and it's obviously very technical under the hood, but I hope I was able to communicate some of that. Thank you.
Ron, thank you very much for the presentation. We've had a couple of questions come in. One is a statement that this is an amazing use of AI, and how do companies access this platform? And you've mentioned that it's going to be coming out soon in order to complete an analysis on design and construction projects, for example, in their location for resiliency. And can they hire your company to do that, or how will they have access to this platform?
So that's a very good question, and thank you for it, because, for example, very recently, we got a database of every cement plant in the world, every every steel plant in the world, every home in North America, every commercial building in North America, and so on. In our platform, the platform is available, the data platform is ready. And because we've calculated this all over the world, given a set of locations of assets, we immediately know the climate exposure of those assets in every single location. So within an hour of dropping in all of the world's cement plants, for example, we could give you ratings on every single one of them. We are dealing with a large bank, for example, that has 2 million mortgages in the US, and another one that has every single pretty much commercial building in France. And just by getting their locations of these assets, or even we can deal with privacy and so on in many ways. I don't want to go into that, but by just getting those locations, we immediately have those that's available. So it's extremely easy for us now to deal with a company like, say, Brookfield, who has not only a whole lot of buildings around the world. We can rate them and rank them and understand where renovations should happen first. Something that might not be affected today could be affected in 2050. And we could also tell them for any new building that they want to look at, how likely is that going to be hit by some climate event. So the other thing is, with this data, our data extends into biodiversity, for example, and the knowledge graph deals with things like flooding in Australia. You might ask the question, what's the next flood in Australia going to cost Australia? Or what's the impact of flooding in Australia and the cost of that impact? Well, we can answer those questions today. So the data platform is available. It's actually going to be made available by a very large corporation. A number of data providers will be able to license it and distribute it. But you can get it directly from us today.
Terrific. Well, Ron, thank you very much for your presentation today. That it seems like you can really, with this platform, investors, financial advisors, analytics companies, banks, you name it, will be able to really zero in on the real estate, if you will, that they are most focused on from an environmental perspective. And they'll also have access to a lot more resources for doing social analysis as well, as you mentioned. And we've been hearing from Ron Dembo. He's the founder of Riskthinking.ai. And Ron had a distinguished academic research career at Yale University, and his company is now going to be bringing a new platform for analytics. It's already available and people can start using it, and you can reach out to Ron through the channel today if you have any questions directly for him. Ron, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks for the invitation, Peter.